Atlas, who wears away heaven, the ancient home of the gods, on his bronze shoulders, was the father of Maia by a goddess. She bore me, Hermes, to great Zeus, and I am the god's servant. I have come to Delphi, this land where Phoebus from his central throne chants to mortals, always declaring the present and the future. For Hellas has a famous city which received its name from Pallas of the Golden Lance. Here Apollo forced a union on Creusa, the child of Erechtheus, where the rocks turned to the north beneath the hill of Pallas's Athenian land, are called Macrae by the lords of Attica. Unknown to her father, such was the pleasure of the god. She bore the weight in her womb. When the time came, Creusa gave birth in the house to a child, and brought the infant to the same cave where the god had bedded her, and there exposed him to die in the round circle of a hollow cradle, observant of the customs of her ancestors, and of Erichthonius the earth-born. Kalimera Sas. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. She who loves Euripides to a frustrating degree, given he was, still, a man. Sometimes I just really like to lean into my general frustration with men. One day they'll give me a reason to stop feeling that way, but today is not that day. But fortunately, once in a while, there is a man who is empathetic, caring, and interesting enough to fuck with in classical Athens. That man was Euripides. And today we are looking closer at what we do and don't know of his life, what we can piece together, and the real man behind some of the most incredible pieces of art from the ancient world. But before that, just a few little updates. I am still working on both an updated merch store and ad-free subscription options for the podcast. I ran into a delay due to being Canadian, something I should be fully prepared for at this point, and yet American businesses never cease to amaze me with their inability to fathom that a large podcast with a substantial American audience is actually Canadian. Truly, it's like every time I work with another company, it seems like I am the first Canadian podcaster they've ever dealt with before. I am forever in awe. I know if you're listening to me, you're unlikely to be that type of American, but I believe you all should know just how wild it is dealing with people in a country that just likes to believe that other countries don't exist, and or that Canada specifically is just an extension of America. Anyway, I didn't know I was going to turn this into that type of rant, but that is the basics behind why there still has not been an official announcement. But I can at least continue sharing what will be offered when I finally sort this out. For a monthly donation, you will be able to get access to ad-free episodes. That is the major drive behind this. I recognize there are a lot of ads, particularly when people find the old episodes of the podcast, which are short, and are required to have the same number of ads, and I understand that it's annoying. I also understand that I want to make a living. I'm giving the option. There will be a few tiers, which each contain more and more bonus content and past episodes ad-free. What with 600 episodes, I'm kind of giving you the option to pay a little less to just get the new ones. There will also be a private Discord server that we're going to be creating where listeners can connect and chat myth all they want. Michaela and I will have access to the server, and we'll try to jump in when we can, but I know that my listeners are just going to love connecting with each other that way too. And on top of that, I have had new stickers and postcards created explicitly for these tiers of subscription, so I'll be mailing listeners thank you notes on these beautiful branded art pieces featuring the characters from the new logo, and I've got stickers of the new logo to send with those thank yous and a limited number of Euripides stickers. It's exciting. But most exciting is that most of the tiers will also contain access to a bonus series that Michaela and I will be hosting together. We are calling it Hermes Historia. Twice a month, Michaela will bring me a topic from history. She will teach me some history, and I will infuse it with mythology. We've already recorded the 2 episodes for September, and they will be released soon as bonus episodes and kind of like sneak peeks into what will, soon, be behind a paywall. And remember, all of this is a donation to the show in exchange for more, but the regular podcast will remain free with ads for those of you who don't mind skipping a few ads. You know, for those of you who do that, nothing will change. But more on that official announcement soon. In other new things, merch is also coming soon. I'm just finishing up a brand new merch site that will live directly in the podcast website. And again, which technologically speaking, just got the better of me. We are building that up to give just generally better access to specific episodes and topics too, and like provide suggestions of where to start. As it turns out that having over 600 episodes available of a podcast makes it pretty difficult to wade through. For the merch, we've got loads of new designs coming too, like the new logo, the individual characters from the new logo, as you might have seen in some of my Instagram posts. We've also got 2 styles of Euripides art coming, both with and without that intricate border that features so many moments of his plays. We've got a design of the Oracle too, the Pythia, which I had created for the group tour this past June. They all got limited edition designs with that piece, but she as a design will be available in a few other pieces of just regular merch. And we've got a new design that I haven't even shared yet. It is called Chthonic Cuties, and I will just leave you all to guess who from the underworld it might feature. But again, that's all coming soon. And finally, last thing, so is International Podcast Day. So I will have more information for you all really soon, but I will be teaming up with 2 other podcasts. Ancient History Fangirl, surprise, surprise, and Movies We Dig. And we will be doing a live stream featuring none other than that goddamn Euripides and his masterpiece, Bacchae. We're going to be reading from it. I did volunteer myself to play Dionysus. Don't worry about it. But also just like loads of joyful nerdiness. And it'll be live streamed on YouTube, so like video. What a wild time. What a wild time. That was a lot of updates, not enough Euripides, but don't worry, we will fix that right about now. This is episode 274. Getting to know an ancient Greek theater kid, Euripides' life and times. Last week, I gave you all a little bit of an overview of Euripides' life and work. But I missed a lot because I was too excited and I didn't read enough of Michaela's research. So guess what? There is more to say about Euripides' life. And aren't we lucky for that? Still, like last week, we need to remember that what we think we know isn't necessarily the truth. Or rather, the whole truth. As with everything in the ancient world, we have to work with what we have. And often, most often I would say, what we have about real historical figures, like Euripides, tends to come from centuries after their deaths. What this means is, often, we have to take a lot of things with a grain of salt. Was this so-called fact about Euripides recorded because it was true, and somehow that information lived on for a couple hundred years in a semi-factual state? Or was it something developed later from actual facts to inform people's knowledge about the ancient tragedians more broadly? It's like we talked about when it comes to where and when he was born. We know with a fair amount of certainty that he was born on the island of Salamis, an island tucked into the Saronic Gulf between Athens and the Argolid Peninsula of the Peloponnese. We know this because basically every source for his early life references that island in some way. But the ways in which they reference it leave a lot of open questions. His birth and childhood have been linked very specifically with the Battle of Salamis, the major naval battle that basically won the Persian War and saved ancient Greece from falling under Persia's control. It was a big deal. And Euripides was born on Salamis, probably, and he was younger than the other 2 more famous tragedians, Aeschylus and Sophocles, and so over the century, those historical facts became kind of mythologized in order to better involve such an important battle in the lives of these 3 incredibly important tragedians. Both Aeschylus and Sophocles fought in important wars. Aeschylus fought in the Persian War and may have been at the Battle of Salamis, something that becomes a fact about his life later, either because it was true or to cement him as this playwright of the Persian War. He wrote a play called The Persians, after all. He definitely fought in the war, so to link him also to Salamis was a way to really emphasize how important he was, whether or not individual details actually took place. Things like this don't necessarily need to be questioned in great detail. It doesn't ultimately matter to us all that much if Aeschylus actually fought in that war. What matters to us is that the Athenians of even just a few decades later believed it. To the Athenians, particularly in the classical period, having fought in a major war or battle really meant something. It reminds me of how Americans view military service, and this is a broad generalization from an outsider, but it always seems to me like what matters more than the actual act of fighting in a war is the idea of having, quote-unquote, served one's country. Now, I'm way too against modern wars to say much more and risk offending everyone, but I think the point is made. My point, ultimately, though, is that Euripides didn't fight in a war, and that did affect how he was viewed by the people of his time and after. It makes me find him far more interesting and gives me even more reasons to appreciate him, but it was a bit of a stain in the ancient world. We can say with almost certainty that he didn't fight in a war, but he wrote about it, and sometimes that made him a little bit less impressive to the Athenians watching and critiquing his plays. Was he allowed to write about such things if he had never experienced them? The answer is yes. Instead, and this is another reason why I love him, Euripides seems to have just been concerned with creative pursuits, writing about things like war rather than necessarily feeling like he needed to experience it. And in 5th century Athens, choosing this life of creative pursuits while other more established tragedians had held high positions in the Athenian military, it was notable. So we will return to those creative pursuits after we do a little more situating ourselves in that 5th century in which Euripides lived and wrote these works that we love so goddamned much. This is for you, Michaela, because last week I got too caught up in Euripides to actually ground the listeners in the time period, like she so kindly planned out for me. There's been a running theme throughout this series where Michaela handles the history and I handle obsessing over Euripides. Because, well, it's something new and different for me to speak about this man, as a real human who lived a real human life, rather than just this author behind some of our favorite characters. Because the thing about 5th century Athens is that, so much fucking happened. The broad idea of what ancient Greece was is basically just 5th century Athens. Imagine 1 century overcoming every single other thing that happened in Greek history to become that kind of iconic, quote unquote, ancient Greece. So much happened, and it formed so much of what Euripides wrote about, what he was interested in, whose stories he wanted to tell. The 5th century of Greece broadly, but Athens specifically, was a time of great discord. Eris was really running amok. It was a time of serious strife in the region. Just endless conflict between the city-states. It starts with a plethora of conflicts that we call the Persian Wars, the War of Aeschylus, and ends with the Peloponnesian War, the war between two halves of the Greeks, those who sided with the Athenians, the Delian League, and those who sided with the Spartans, the Peloponnesian League, and who sided with whom was not always voluntary. This war changed Greece forever, and Athens forever specifically, and not for the better. It also took place in a time when they were giving democracy a whirl, when they faced an utterly deadly plague, and so much more. There was a century defined by wars that ravaged across the Aegean Sea. And as with any major conflict, the ways in which these conflicts affected the people who lived through them, regardless of whether they fought, shaped the way those people experienced their own world. And Euripides absolutely falls into this category. It's just that we also happen to have enough of his works that we can examine how moments from history might be revealed within his plays. Euripides was, I think it's fairly safe to say, consumed by the subject of war and how it affected everyone, not just the men fighting. And through these moments in history, we can begin to imagine how it is that Euripides came to be so interested in people who were marginalized, who were forgotten by so many other writers, and yet who were often most affected by these endless conflicts. In the ancient world, war meant not only death and destruction, but enslavement of those who lost and didn't die. It's something that we can see in different ways throughout Euripides' work, and notably, just the way he was interested in those people, the people whose lives changed in horrible ways. Hi, this is a quick little addendum to this general episode. I've put it in with this break just because I think it was easier than finding the exact right place because I ranted a lot in this episode. I want to explain. I want to apologize for coming at democracy as hard as I do in this episode at the time that I did it. Honestly, I'm Canadian. I have been fortunate enough to be able to kind of block out the American election out of just pure frustration at the entire world. And so I honestly did not consider the timing of this. I'm not going to try to rewrite the whole episode, but I do apologize for that. Just because I think democracy is broken and definitely should be changed, or we should have a different system, doesn't mean that we should not vote to maintain the best possible system while we change it from within, right? In order to change something, you do have to exist within its system, especially something like this. And so I am not saying don't vote. You should absolutely vote. I'm really making a point of just not talking about the American election, and I recognize that I have a lot of privilege to be able to do that, and honestly, I'm not going to change it, but I know this is really important for a lot of people, so I just want to make clear that that was not my intention. We absolutely need to vote within democracy and change democracy in order to fix it so that it is actually something that is the rule by the people, because right now it's not, but that doesn't mean that voting isn't important. As Michaela and I try to pick apart this biography of Euripides, something that's become more and more obvious to me is that the best way of learning about the real man who lived and died as Euripides is through his work and not necessarily the biographical tradition that followed him. There were biographies written of Euripides, but as with the other sources that I've mentioned today and last week, they were for the most part written well over a century after his death. One of our most extensive surviving biographies on Euripides is Life of Euripides by Satyros, a Hellenistic biographer. It survives only in fragments and is presented in the form of a dialogue. This is like a common form of writing prose in the ancient world, think Plato, but it also allows a degree of separation between the author and the contents. Plato wrote a dialogue about Atlantis, but we know it isn't Atlantis that he was really talking about, but power and tyranny and countless other things. In this fragmentary life of Euripides, it isn't quite so obviously fictitious, but the way it's written and the fact that by the time centuries had passed, we can better understand the fragments as meant to be not what Satyros is saying necessarily, but what people in the wider cultural conversation have been saying about Euripides' life. Some other bits of his personality that we are able to parse from the sources, or rather assume based on all the varied factors that I've talked about, and which I am personally thrilled to learn, is that almost certainly Euripides was an introvert. From what we can gather, he was a voracious reader, a book nerd, with a collection liable to stop my own heart. And supposedly he didn't care for the symposium and what went down there, like partying and debauchery and the like. He seemed to be quite a private and quiet guy who greatly appreciated solitude. Because he wasn't quite relatable enough already. Euripides was even said to frequent a cave on Salamis, where he would go to escape from the crowds and I guess just sit in the silence and think. I really hope this is true because God's like, I see you, Euripides. I see you. This supposed cave even became popular as a tourist site in later Roman times when tourists would want to travel to the place that Euripides was said to have just written his plays, And supposed facts like these are pretty easy to believe. They might be directly coming from a source that's really removed from Euripides' lived experience, but often they fit into the general vibe that he gives off in his surviving works. There are more technical ways of looking at this. I like to say vibes. But nothing about this is a surprise for a man who wrote the plays that he did. My dude was neurodivergent as shit. And we just gotta figure out how and why and love him for it. But beyond little bits of his life like these, when it comes to broader cultural conversations about Euripides, there tends to be a lot of misunderstandings and slander involved. Straight slander. And even this, though, could have been intended as slanderous, right? It wasn't normal that a wealthy aristocratic Athenian wouldn't frequent the symposia. But even if it was meant as slander, it could very well be true. Remember, the ancient world also had a habit of assuming that because Euripides wrote female characters who did bad things, who were complex and realistic to us today but also unlikable, tended to mean that they called him a misogynist, or since such a word would be utterly nonsensical to such an audience because men were what mattered. People liked to assume that his characters resulted in the real women of Athens hating him for slandering them in such a way. It's just that while most of those assumptions that we find in later works written about Euripides after his death are coming from Aristophanes. He's caused so much turmoil. Honestly, I do hope to dedicate an entire episode of this series to looking at the slander, either intentional or lovingly committed by Aristophanes against Euripides. There's a lot. It's really fun. But until then, I want you all to understand, why is it that his biography is not only murky and confusing, but also often, very possibly, straight up bullshit. I don't think a man who hates women and wishes them harm would write the Creusa, who appears in Euripides' Ion. That's the opening passage I read at the top of the episode. I don't think a man who thinks women were terrible creatures would write Medea as sympathetic and conflicted while she does what she does. But today is not about his female characters. I'm sorry, they are getting an entire day to themselves soon. But so long as you all understand how and why our knowledge of the man himself is so fragmentary and baffling, we're going to move on to some more history, both Euripidean and just Athenian. The same biographical tradition that I just warned you all about tells a few interesting things about Euripides. Quote-unquote facts that we must still take with this grain of salt, but often which offer the only insights we might have about him. So according to Isabelle Torrance, whose book is simply titled Euripides, she tells us a little about these potential questionable sources and what they say about his early life. This biographical tradition, quote, claims that Euripides first trained as a painter before becoming a student of major contemporary philosophers such as Anaxagoras, Prodicus, Protagoras, and Socrates, turning to the art of tragedy only after these earlier experiences. Now, Torrance goes on to say that these sorts of claims can certainly also be made entirely based on his surviving plays themselves, which, quote, demonstrate a particular sensitivity to art and architecture and a deep fascination with different philosophical and theological viewpoints. Now, I reference this detail specifically because those ideas about his character not only come from the biographical tradition that is so separate from his actual life, and yet they can be still easily corroborated by his surviving work. Comparing things like this appears to be our best means of determining anything definitive about him. Now, the timelines of those philosophers that I mentioned in the quote don't really work in terms of, like who was alive and when. But that's a common issue with ancient biographies, and it's exactly why these kinds of corroborations with his surviving work are so helpful. Like, we could pretty safely say that if Euripides studied under any philosopher, he certainly couldn't and wouldn't have studied under all of those men named, but based on his work, we can get an idea that he was, at least, really interested in philosophy as an art form. Now, he's also just an aristocratic Athenian, so these would be natural things for him to learn, but it's the way he used them in his plays that leads us to think that he was interested. And this kind of thing is really common, too, when it comes to these biographies broadly. In the ancient world, these writers had a habit of imagining that, like, all of these famous people must have flocked together. They're writing centuries later, and they wouldn't have had the type of record keeping that would have allowed them to confirm these facts or dates. So biographers would make assumptions and leaps based on what they did know, but they would really want to make these people seem like they all kind of got together, right? Like, you want to make these connections. It can make it trickier for us today, but no less interesting. It's like the issue with his birth, too, right? Like, was he really born at the Battle of Salamis when Aeschylus was fighting and Sophocles was dancing in a victory parade? It's seriously unlikely. Imagine the number of coincidences that would have to, coincide in order for that to be realistic. But later, when historians and biographers are learning and writing about these great men of the past, they're going to link them together for a whole host of big and small reasons. They're not necessarily concerned with ensuring that every single thing is factually accurate. It's just that it makes everyone seem more connected, more interesting, more competitive, and even collaborative. And Torrance provides another example of how we might corroborate these questionable biographical details by looking at Euripides' surviving work. And I mean, this is like a throwaway, but it's one that I'm pretty obsessed with and kind of referenced earlier. Quote, "The suggestion made in Aristophanes that he was an avid book collector is corroborated by the intertextual nature of his dramas." That's adorable. I mean, I think we can all safely assume this to be true. If Euripides wasn't a book nerd, then who is? And another fact about him that I believe is just very, very safe to assume is just that he cared. Maybe I'm projecting a little, but the evidence is there, even if it might not be as strong as it is in my mind. But he did. He cared. And I mean this in every sense of the word. It seems to me that Euripides was well aware of the politics of his time, the issues of the world around him, and even, I think, the crimes of the empire he lived under. And so we return to a little of the history of the 5th century and how it informed Euripides' work. Remember, we think Euripides was born in the general realm of 480 BCE. We think this because of how his birth and childhood were linked to the Battle of Salamis, like I said, which took place in 480. Because of that, Euripides would have grown up during and after the formation of the Delian League and the rise of Athenian power within the Aegean. 3 years after the Battle of Salamis, Athens and several other city-states within the Aegean, think islands, they came together to form the Delian League. Like I said, islands. It's named for the island of Delos, the island sacred to Apollo, and a kind of neutral ground for the formation of the League. At least, that was the intention at the time. The primary focus of this league was to fend off further attacks from the Persians in the Greek waters and to get revenge for the Persian War. The Persians, remember, sacked Athens and burned the Acropolis, among other major incidents of destruction. So, the Athenians were specifically not feeling super pumped, and were pretty embarrassed. No one likes an embarrassed empire. City-states that joined the Delian League could either provide fully armed triremes, ships, or contribute financially to a shared treasury that was housed on Delos. This is important. Members of the League agreed to support each other in their conflicts and to not fight each other. It's like basically the purpose, in addition to protecting from Persia. But from the beginning, Athens had considerable power as the state, which set the tribute levies and just the acting treasurer. Remember, embarrassed empire. Through the 470s, the Delian League participated in a number of battles in order to solidify their power along the boundaries. And during this time, Athens was also creating colonies along the Thracian coast to the north. Eventually, though, one of these city-states decided to revolt in reaction to rising Athenian hegemony. In 465, the city-state/island of Thassos attempted to leave the Delian League due to some conflicts over control of silver deposits on the Thracian mainland. Michaela wrote, obviously, all of this. Sparta was asked to support the Thasians and invade Attica, but this was held off because then there was an earthquake in 464, and after that a revolt of Sparta's enslaved population of Helots, which prevented Sparta from helping. And remember, Spartan enslavement was just the whole other fucking beast. Whew. But the revolt was eventually ended, but it was overall a major event in a series of events that was eventually coined the Pentakontaia. Basically, the word just means 50-year period, and I probably pronounced it poorly. Simply put, the Pentakontaia, that horrible pronunciation, Liv. I can see the word 50 in there, and that's it. Anyway, it was just this period between the end of the war, the end of the Persian War in 479, and the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, officially, in 431. This period is important for today's episode because it was defined by the rise of Athens' power in the Aegean. Athens went from just any old city-state into basically an empire that used force and coercion to get other city-states to cooperate with whatever they wanted. Does this sound familiar? If not, were you born after the year 2006? Anyway, it turns out empires are fucking deadly and basically just ruin the lives of everyone in every country outside of that empire's control. And also hundreds of thousands of lives of people under the empire who don't fit into what the empire deems to be valuable. No idea why that would sound familiar for those of us who lived through, the year 2001 to... Oh, it's still going on. Huh. In any case, this not at all familiar story of an empire becoming too rich and powerful to be anything other than murderously destructive culminated in the treasury of the Delian League being moved from the semi-neutral but definitely in the middle of the League's territory, Delos, to Athens. This happened in 454. And that year, or 455, kind of in between, is when Euripides' first play was staged at the city Dionysia in Athens. And with the moving of the Delian League treasury, this is also when we get to officially call Athens an empire. As if I haven't already. Because if it looks like an empire and behaves like an empire, then shucks, it's an empire. During this time, Athens is being led by a man named Pericles. It would take days to cover everything there is to know about Pericles, so we're not doing that. But here are some Cliff's Notes for our purposes. We're not necessarily being super kind to Pericles. I'm sure there are lots of really nice things to say. But Pericles was ostensibly a democratic leader of Athens. The democratic leader of Athens. People like to call him the father of democracy. They like to say it as if this was some incredible thing that was only good and perfect. Even now, we in the West love talking about democracy as if it was like the confirmed best way of leading a country. As if there is nothing that will ever be better and that it is a perfect structure of perfection and we should never seek to change it. And Pericles, he did a lot of good things. This isn't shit on Pericles hour, but it is where I tell you that after Athens took their empire to the next level and transferred the treasury of the Delian League from, again, the semi-neutral ground of the island of Delos, far from Athens, to Athens, far from most of the Delian League. Well, it was about that time that Pericles just happened, how lucky, he happened to find a shit ton of money to rebuild Athens. To make Athens great again, if you will. Because, well, it turns out that when an empire controls an enormous amount of people and states beyond the single state that the empire favors and immediately resides in, say Athens, or, I don't know, a country south of my own, that empire tends to favor the wealth and safety of the people directly benefiting from it over innocent lives of everyone else. It's weird, I know. So with money from the Delian League's treasury, this Delian League, all of this collected wealth from all of the other city-states, all of which were considerably poorer than Athens. With that money, Pericles set out on an enormous building project in Athens. With the Delian League money, he rebuilt a large amount of the Acropolis. It had been destroyed by the Persians. He built not only the Parthenon itself, but also the Propylaea, which is the monumental entrance building that leads to the Acropolis. He also had built a towering, and I mean towering, statue of Athena, which was sculpted by the famous Phidias, a friend of Pericles. Democracy is nothing if not fair. Pericles used an enormous, and I mean enormous, amount of the Delian League's treasury to rebuild Athens. The rest of the Delian League, many other city-states, which had pledged themselves to helping each other, to gathering what little wealth they could muster in order to provide safety for all of the people to the east of Athens, between Athens and the Persian Empire. The one they're defending themselves against. Basically, all of those people just had to sit back and watch while Athens used all their money on things that wouldn't remotely deter the Persians from another invasion, but which made Athens look like the wealthy and powerful empire it was styling itself as. Again, it's not at all familiar. Do you want to take a guess at how the poorer people of Athens did with all of this? Wasn't great! And of course, most of the records we have at this time and the actions of the Athenians were recorded by, the Athenians. Which is why Pericles is lauded as the father of democracy and not a leader who embezzled an enormous amount of wealth from the people and used it to make himself look impressive. It's why we in the West are led to believe that it is our moral right to force democracy on every other nation, no matter what the people want. And to define democracy as the only possible correct option for leading a country. It's why we now use our empire to demonize people who don't fall into what we in the West have determined is right and best. Anyway, I'm not saying I have anything alternative to democracy to propose for countries of the world, but I am saying that democracy was corrupt and benefited only the wealthy even from the beginning, and that maybe we shouldn't assume that humanity's ability to perfect political structures peaked 2,500 years ago and should never be re-examined in light of, 25 centuries of change in human evolution. I did not expect this episode. That happens every time. It's fun, though. Another thing that Pericles is famous for, and which ties directly into this world that we are situating ourselves in, is citizenship laws. This is going to be quick and basic, but also important, because, God, this episode is seriously long enough already, and we're not done. Pericles introduced a number of laws defining Athenian citizenship. It was pretty strict before Pericles, and then it got even stricter. Essentially, these laws defined Athenian citizens as boys, men, born to 2 Athenian parents. Women couldn't technically be citizens, but they still were required to be Athenians in order to create an Athenian. These laws severely, and I mean severely, limited who did and did not have rights in Athens. but it also served to ensure that no one could reasonably become an Athenian. My past episode with Rebecca Fudo-Kennedy goes into detail about these citizenship laws. It was really good. And specifically how they affected foreign women, which was the premise of that episode. So if you're interested, you can listen to that. But for my purposes, we just need to know that these laws were strict. They required both a son's parents to have been Athenian in order for him to be Athenian, and essentially ruled out anyone in the Delian League who wasn't Athenian. So in 431, the Peloponnesian War officially started. Pericles had spent and continued to spend the League's money on his building projects, which only benefited Athenian men. He ensured that non-citizens had minimal rights and almost no means of becoming citizens, no matter how hard they tried, and in the same year, Euripides staged Medea at the city Dionysia. You remember Medea, the play about a foreign woman whose children, under Athens' new citizenship laws, were not and could not be citizens, and therefore would be forced into poverty despite their father's aristocratic citizen status. Oh, right, and that father left his non-citizen wife and non-citizen children for a citizen wife so that he could father new citizen children. 2 years later, 2 years after Medea was staged and these citizenship laws came into effect, Athens was hit with a plague, and Pericles' 2 legitimate citizen sons died of the plague. Pericles was dying too, but the only son he had left was not an Athenian citizen. Why, you ask? Oh, well, Pericles left his wife some years earlier. Quite literally, he sold her off to marry another man, and now Wikipedia gets to call it a divorce. And he took up a sexual relationship with Aspasia, a wealthy hetairai from Corinth. Not Athenian. So naturally, the citizenship laws were changed to ensure that this last surviving son of Pericles was granted the citizenship that his father had withheld from everyone else. Because just like Google told me, states with democratic governments prevent rule by autocrats, guarantee fundamental individual rights, allow for a relatively high level of political equality, and rarely make war on each other. Turns out the first democracy had about, this is a guess, but it's a good one, maybe a quarter of the people living, residing, maybe even born in Athens could actually vote. Everything I've just told you and everything we in the West have been living these past decades definitely sounds like we've prevented the rule of autocrats, though, right? Democracy works. We've definitely guaranteed fundamental individual rights for everybody. It's going well. Euripides died in Macedon in the winter of 407 into 406 BCE. He'd been invited by the king at the time, Archelaus, about whom he wrote a play, also called Archelaus, in honor of the king, but telling the story of a descendant of Heracles by the same name. That play is lost, of course, but it gives us this insight into these final years of Euripides' life. He was in his 70s and still writing his most brilliant works. Right to the end, Euripides ensured he told stories that no one else seemed to be interested in, or rather, no one was interested in telling the way he was interested in telling it. Iphigenia, Aulis, and Bacchae were both written toward the end of his life, and Euripides didn't live long enough to see either of them staged. As I mentioned last week, these 2 plays, and one other, Alcmaeon and Corinth, which is lost, were produced posthumously. It's believed that one of Euripides' sons, named for his father, produced these 3 plays after his death. And it was then that Euripides won his 5th prize at the city Dionysia. It is all too appropriate that the playwright who most pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in Athenian society, who seems to have critiqued Athenian laws and social structure through his artwork, a man who pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable even amongst the gods, won only his 5th first prize for a play that features a mischievous god returning to his hometown and being told he's basically not a citizen. And, well, you remember how Bacchae ends up. It just feels like peak Euripides to win with a play that features not only a god as the main character, but one who is both foreign and local, one who is traveling with a pack of singing, drunken, orgiastic women, and who is willing to have them kill a man for his impiety and general awfulness. What a legacy, Euripides. Well, nerds, it turns out to absolutely no one's surprise, I can talk a lot about Euripides. I had every intention of talking about his wives today. He had 2! But here we are. It turns out Michaela is right, and looking at the moments in 5th century history and how they tie in with him and his work is legitimately so fucking interesting, and I didn't even do as much of it as I planned. Honestly, last week I finished the episode, which was so much fun. But then I thought, shit, I really want to talk more about how these issues happening around him influenced his work. Particularly that siege of Milos that I mentioned last week. That's what today's episode was supposed to be. But Pericles went and invented democracy and set me off. Anyway, we will be devoting an entire episode to looking at how Euripides wrote about enslaved people and women. So, gods, we will return to that moment and how his play, The Trojan Women, might just be a supremely obvious critique of the genocide of Milos that was committed by the Athenians, let alone all of his other plays. I really, really want to look at what he might have been saying about Athenian society. But at least now you have a good grounding in what the fuck was going on in Athens, because, truly, an entire world of history happened in 5th century Athens. But that's for next week, because today's episode is already 6,000 words long. I love my job. I love Euripides so fucking much. I don't know. This series could go on forever. It won't, I promise, but we're gonna continue having fun. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermians to my Olympians. She is the producer who put together most of this research for Euripides. But don't worry, I'll be reading all the plays. That's our deal. Select music in this episode was by Luke Chaos. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Stay tuned for more new information about how you can support the show and get access to ad-free episodes. All of that is coming soon, along with countless other things. One of these days, I'll get it all together. In the meantime, though, we're having fucking fun. I am Liv, and I love Euripides more than... I don't want to say any other man, but any other man who isn't related to me? Is that too much? I love him. I really want a time machine. Imagine the questions I would ask.